Title: The Search for the Real Mount Sinai, a mystery that has never been solved. Somewhere in the desert, there is a mountain that changed the course of human history. 3 religions, billions of believers. 1 law, carved in stone, handed down in fire and smoke. And here is the strange part. Nobody actually knows for certain which mountain it was. For 1,500 years, pilgrims have climbed a granite peak in Egypt believing it is the place where Moses met God. But a growing number of researchers say they have been climbing the wrong mountain entirely, and that the real answer may be sitting 200 miles away, across a stretch of water, in a country that almost never lets outsiders in. For most of history, the location of Mount Sinai was not a settled question at all. The Bible describes it in vivid terms: a mountain wrapped in smoke, trembling under thunder, struck by fire from the sky, with the Israelites camped on a wide plain at its base. But the text itself never gives coordinates. It never names a modern location. For roughly 3 centuries after the events of Exodus were said to have taken place, nobody could point to a specific peak and say, with confidence, this is the one. That changed in the 4th century, when Helena, the mother of the Roman Emperor Constantine, traveled through the Holy Land identifying sites she believed were connected to biblical events. Helena was not an archaeologist. She worked from local tradition, from monks and guides who offered their best guesses, and from her own conviction. One of the places she designated was a granite peak in the southern Sinai Peninsula, in what is now Egypt. Within a couple of centuries, a monastery, St. Catherine's, had been built at its base, and the identification hardened into tradition. Monks documented it. Pilgrims visited it. Empires blessed it. And once a tradition survives 15 centuries, it stops feeling like a guess and starts feeling like a fact. But traditions are not evidence, and in recent decades, researchers going back to the original texts and the physical landscape have raised real questions about whether Helena's 4th century guess actually holds up. Start with the geology. The biblical description of Sinai is dramatic: smoke rising like the smoke of a furnace, the whole mountain quaking, fire visible on the summit. Read literally, that sounds like it could describe some kind of volcanic or geothermal event. The traditional site in Egypt, Jebel Musa, is made of granite. Granite doesn't burn, smoke, or blacken from the inside the way a volcanic peak might. There's no geological record of that kind of activity anywhere in the southern Sinai. That doesn't disprove the tradition. Ancient theophany language is often symbolic, not a geology report, but it is one of the first cracks skeptics point to. Then there's the terrain. The biblical account describes a population large enough to require serious space and water at the base of the mountain. The area around Jebel Musa is narrow, rocky, and short on water. It's not impossible that a smaller historical group could have camped there, but it's a tight fit for the picture the text paints. And then there's geography of a different kind, political geography. The Bible places Mount Sinai in the land of Midian, the region where Moses fled after killing an Egyptian overseer, the place where he married into a priestly family and encountered the burning bush. Midian, in most historical and geographical reconstructions, sits not in the Sinai Peninsula at all, but east of the Gulf of Aqaba, in what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia. The Apostle Paul, writing in the New Testament, states plainly that Sinai is in Arabia. That single line has fueled centuries of quiet scholarly debate, because if you take it seriously, the traditional Egyptian site may simply be in the wrong country. This is where Jabal al-Lawz enters the story. It's a mountain in northwestern Saudi Arabia, near the ancient territory of Midian, and since researchers began examining it more seriously in the 1980s, it has become the leading alternative candidate for the real Mount Sinai. People who have visited or studied satellite imagery of the site describe a summit that appears darkened, almost scorched, in a way that stands out from the surrounding rock. At the base, there's a plain large enough to plausibly host a substantial encampment, something the traditional site struggles to offer. Some researchers have pointed to piles of stones they interpret as altar remains, petroglyphs of cattle they connect to the golden calf story, and a large split boulder some believe matches the account of Moses striking a rock to bring forth water. It's a compelling list. It's important to say clearly, not something mainstream biblical archaeology accepts. Most professional archaeologists and geologists who have examined the claims about Jabal al-Lawz consider the evidence inconclusive at best. The scorching on the peak has plausible natural explanations: mineral staining, weathering, or manganese and iron oxide coating, which is a known phenomenon called desert varnish that can darken rock surfaces over long periods without any fire at all. The stone piles and petroglyphs at the site have not been reliably dated to the Late Bronze Age, the period associated with the historical exodus, and some appear to be far more recent, tied to later nomadic or Islamic-era use of the region. Chariot wheel-shaped formations reported on the floor of the Gulf of Aqaba near Nuweiba, often cited as evidence of a mass crossing, have been examined by marine geologists and are generally explained as coral growth and natural seabed formations, not archaeological remains. None of that means the Jabal al-Lawz hypothesis is worthless. It means it's a hypothesis, an intriguing one, argued passionately by a mix of independent researchers, some credentialed geologists, and religious investigators, but one that has not cleared the bar of peer-reviewed archaeological consensus. Serious historians and biblical scholars remain split, and a fair number consider both major candidate sites, Jebel Musa in Egypt and Jabal al-Lawz in Saudi Arabia, to be plausible without either being proven. So, why hasn't this simply been settled with a shovel and a research permit? This is the part of the story that tends to get dressed up as a conspiracy, and it's worth being precise about what's actually true. Saudi Arabia does restrict archaeological access to large parts of its territory, and Jabal al-Lawz sits inside a military-controlled zone, which makes independent excavation extremely difficult. That much is documented and real. But it's worth putting that restriction in context. Saudi Arabia limits foreign archaeological access broadly, across many sites for many reasons that have nothing to do with any one biblical claim: security concerns near sensitive borders, general caution about foreign researchers, and a slow, historically underdeveloped domestic archaeology sector that has only in the last decade or so begun opening up meaningfully to international teams and tourism. Treating that broad, structural caution as proof of a deliberate 70-year cover-up of one specific mountain requires a much bigger leap than the evidence supports. There is no confirmed document, leaked report, or credible insider account showing that any government has identified Jabal al-Lawz as the confirmed site of Sinai and is actively hiding that conclusion. What we actually have is restricted general access, an unresolved scholarly debate, and a gap that speculation has rushed in to fill. Egypt's incentive is often described the same way, that Cairo protects the traditional site because St. Catherine's Monastery is a major tourism draw. That's true as far as it goes. St. Catherine's is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a genuine pillar of religious tourism in the Sinai. But having an economic interest in a long-standing tourist site is not the same as suppressing an alternate discovery. Egypt's tourism industry existed and thrived around the site for over 1,000 years before Jabal al-Lawz was ever proposed as an alternative in the 20th century. The economic motive is plausible as a reason institutions aren't eager to promote a rival theory. It is not evidence of an active cover-up. What's really going on is something less cinematic than a conspiracy, but honestly more interesting if you sit with it. An open question in ancient history that modern political boundaries have made very hard to investigate properly. The relevant region straddles sensitive, heavily controlled territory. The physical evidence that exists is ambiguous enough to support multiple readings. And a debate that started as careful textual and geological analysis has, over the decades, been picked up by documentary producers and online creators who tend to flatten unresolved into hidden and restricted military zone into deliberate suppression. That's a much better story to tell. It's just not necessarily a true one. What would it take to actually resolve this? Systematic, dated excavation at Jabal al-Lawz, conducted by international teams with proper access, using the same standards of stratigraphy and dating applied everywhere else in biblical archaeology. Comparable renewed study at Jebel Musa and other candidate sites in the Sinai Peninsula that have also been proposed over the years, because Jabal al-Lawz isn't even the only alternative theory in circulation. And a willingness on all sides to accept whatever the evidence actually shows, rather than what any particular tradition, tourism board, or theory needs it to show. Until that happens, the honest answer is the unsatisfying one. Nobody knows for certain where Mount Sinai is. The traditional site carries the weight of 15 centuries of devotion but rests on a 4th century identification made without archaeological method. The alternative site in Saudi Arabia offers tantalizing details but lacks the rigorous, independently verified dating that would turn a hypothesis into a fact. Somewhere between those two mountains, or perhaps at neither of them, sits the real answer to one of history's oldest geographical puzzles. Maybe that mountain will eventually be identified beyond doubt. Maybe it never will be. But the story of how we've searched for it, through 4th century travelers, 20th century explorers, satellite imagery, and a tangle of restricted borders, says as much about human belief and the pull of certainty as it does about geology or archaeology. We want the mountain to be found. We want the mystery closed. Sometimes, though, the honest version of history is the one that stays open, waiting for better evidence, rather than the one that promises a hidden truth was there all along.